The Communion of Saints is a series that seeks to share information on the life and times of the saints of the Catholic Church. Your program hosts are Father Jim Corda and Father Jack Lavelle.
Hello and welcome to this edition of Communion of Saints. I'm Father Jim Corda.
And I'm Father Jack Lavelle.
And the saint we're going to begin with is Saint John Baptist de la Salle. It's interesting because when we hear of John Baptist de la Salle, many people will think, well, are we talking about John the Baptist from the Bible? Obviously not. Let's tell the folks that are with us when he was born and when he died.
He was born in 1651, so mid-17th century, dies in 1719. It's important to note he was a French priest and was the founder of the Institute of the Brothers of the Christian Schools, and we call that the de la Salle Brothers, so they bear his name. In the U.S., it's known as the Christian Brothers. And so I think that might conjure up for more people an immediate understanding of what the charism of this community must be, because we know that the Christian Brothers are very much involved in education, specifically religious education, but in colleges, in high schools, universities, to continue to bring this knowledge and this wisdom of many subjects, but usually with the discipline of theology and the love of the Lord involved in it.
What's interesting is that this is one of the few, if not only, religious order that is dedicated only to brothers. Mm-hmm. And so there are no priests within this teaching order. And that was unique at the time and continues to be unique today, because many of the religious communities that have priests, many of them have brothers, but none have only brothers. But it's interesting because they've educated the poor from the beginning of their foundation, but also across the time. And they are so numerous throughout the world. We know that there's 6,000 lay brothers and 75,000 lay and religious colleagues that work with them. And we've talked about that whole sense of affiliation before. We know that many religious congregations, because of attrition, are getting smaller. Young men and women are not responding as readily to the call to become religious priests, brothers and sisters. And so we see this whole affiliation by lay people who share that charism, who want to do what they do. And so that's really a large number of people that are affiliated with the Christian Brothers worldwide, 75,000. And they serve as teachers and counselors, so that charism is primarily as a teacher. And that's one of the communities that pretty much has stayed pretty much focused and basic to their charism, staying as a teaching order.
Absolutely. And we've seen, some orders have not necessarily abandoned their charisms, but have maybe diversified or consolidated, to respond to the needs and the call and their particular circumstances. But you're right, the Christian Brothers have been able to maintain that single-minded focus on Catholic education, religious education, and rather than abandon their charism or even change and say, well, if we invite ordained priests into the order, we might be able to also go and do this or go and do that. Rather, they invite lay people in on that journey of faith in education. And we see that when we talk about the 75,000 people who are assisting them, they're in 1,000 institutions across 84 countries. So obviously, the focus that they have sought to remain with has flourished and continues to work in being true to their call.
And we know that historically they developed the first Catholic school system in the country of France. We've talked about those individuals that created the school system, whether it be here in the United States or in other countries around the world. So there's that whole sense that Catholic schools were developed for a particular reason. We know historically why they were developed here. Why do you think in France that no doubt would have been a Catholic country, would have had a Catholic school not until the time of John Baptist de La Salle.
Well, one of the things would be the accessibility of education anyway, the need for this type of structure. You certainly would have had already the development of higher institutes of learning, but those would be reserved for young men of wealth or who had a patron, who might want to recognize in them a certain intellect, and so they go on and they, receive a degree or training in a particular discipline, doctors, lawyers, professionals of that sort. But you're at this point, you still weren't really in need of education for the masses. And if you were of a wealthy home or noble family, and you were, of course, in France of the Catholic faith, there might have been individual tutoring for your children, but even your daughters would be taught what they needed to make it into a good marriage. So maybe they would learn languages and they would learn some things about the arts. But really, there would be this growing understanding that as God's children, we're all called to a certain dignity, a certain reverence, a certain respect, and so we need to offer a basic education, but again, always with the faith. There was this teaching of the faith. And so it would have flourished and expanded into inviting people of different economic levels. Not that the school would have them all of different economic levels, but there would be schools, and this is where we see an emergence of schools for poorer children who didn't have access to the other types of education already going on.
And I know we've spoken on several occasions with some of the other saints that this is one of the saints that was recognized by Leo XIII and was canonized by him at the beginning of the 20th century. And so with his whole sense of social teaching, he recognized in John Baptist de La Salle the whole need to have teachers of the faith. He's declared a patron of teachers by Pius XII. So there's this distinction that continues throughout his life, but also throughout the life of the church. And how, as we look at certain saints and them as patrons, we encourage the teachers that might be listening to talk and pray to John Baptist de La Salle, because let's face it, in this day and age, the teaching profession is not always one of the easiest things, especially if you're teaching the faith to young people. Sometimes the youngest minds are very receptive to that, but the older a child or individual gets, sometimes their minds and hearts are not always receptive to that. And perhaps through the intercession of John Baptist de La Salle, they might instill within a child or particular child some grain of faith that continues to grow. We're going to talk about a few other saints in just a moment, but we just want to close with his feast day is April 7th, and we're going to talk about another saint in just a moment. So stay with us. We'll be right back.
I spent 34 years as a teacher.
I just loved interacting with the students.
Many sisters, brothers, and religious order priests served for little pay, and now their communities lack retirement funds.
My very first class had 56 first graders.
Gifts to the Retirement Fund for Religious help provide for medications, nursing care, and more. Please give to those who have given a lifetime. Donate at your local parish.
God bless you for your help.
Whether it's passing on medicine, a blanket, or something as simple as a glass of water, that's how compassion works. And that's how Maryknoll works, hand to hand to hand. For nearly 100 years, Maryknoll's been passing on your help to the priests and brothers working in 26 countries around the world. Maryknoll, an American Catholic organization, dedicates 86 cents of every dollar donated to their programs, serving the world's poor and powerless. And that's how it works. Compassion flows from your hand to the hand of someone in need. Hand to hand to hand. That's Maryknoll.
That's Maryknoll. That's Marino.
That's Marino.
That's Marino.
That's Marino.
That's Marino.
That's Marino.
That's Marino. That's Marino.
Welcome back to Communion of Saints. The saint we're going to discuss now is Saint Stanislaus. And while we don't have a lot of particular items to mention or interesting things about him, we want to talk about the day and age in which he lived. And then we'll talk about his country. Then we'll talk about some similarities that we have in his life mirrored to another saint in England. So let's talk first of all about the day and age in which he lived.
Well, Stanislaus was born in the 11th century, lived throughout the 11th century, born in 1030 and dies in 1079. We know that he is a priest and rises to the ranks of bishop. And for those of our viewers that might not necessarily understand the derivative of the name Stanislaus, obviously he is Polish, and he is the Bishop of Krakow. Now that will sound very familiar to most of our viewers because we know that our late Holy Father, St. Pope John Paul II, was from Poland and was the Archbishop of Krakow when he was called by the Holy Spirit to become no longer Cardinal Karol Wojtyła, but to become John Paul II. But what is interesting about the Bishop of Krakow that we're talking about, Stanislaus, was that there was this conflict with the King of Poland at the time. And we've spoken about a variety of saints, not that find themselves in this specific type of circumstance, but when the Church finds opposition within the power structure of the country or the region or the territory that they are part of. Now, we're no longer talking about the church being illegal in 1st and 2nd century Jerusalem and beyond, but we are talking about conflicts with the King of Poland. Now, where do some of these conflicts arise from? Well, they arise from political power structures that maybe are organized to keep differences among the population, the poor versus the rich, the educated versus the uneducated, how it all works. And then the church comes and speaks the power of God and the dignity and the equality of all of God's children, and that everyone has the opportunity to develop their God-given talents. And then you can have discussions about why are some people poor and why are some people rich. Whatever it may be, the language of Jesus, we see, was a challenge to the governing authority at the time, and we see the same thing happening to Stanislaus in opposition of the King of Poland.
When we talk about Stanislaus, he is a martyr. What's interesting is that he was martyred while he was celebrating Mass. While many people would see that as rather ungodly and gruesome, what better place to give up your life as a priest or as a bishop while celebrating the Eucharist. And I think in modern times of Oscar Romero, whose cause is being undertaken, who also was martyred, many say, during the celebration of Mass. And how important it is that during these struggles, as you had mentioned, within various countries, not because of the illegality of the faith, but because of whatever power struggles are going on there, that many people, in particular St. Stanislaus, remain steadfast and firm in his faith. We're going to talk also about comparison with another saint. We've talked about this saint from England in one of our past segments. And let's talk about Thomas Becket and why there's this similarity between Stanislaus and Thomas Becket.
Well, if some of our viewers who've been good viewers and have seen this series throughout, we have talked about Thomas à Becket. And Thomas à Becket, the Archbishop of Canterbury, who was martyred during the reign of King Henry II. Story tells us Thomas and Henry were very good friends, although there were differences in their station in life. Henry was king, and Thomas started out studying to be a cleric, abandoned that, became a supporter of the king, not of noble birth, not of any rank or wealth, but someone that the king associated with. And then the king, in his desire to control the church and control the lands and the wealth of the church, decides to call in a favor. And as happened many times, kings could collaborate with the Holy See in appointing archbishops and bishops to certain dioceses. And so he decides he is going to appoint Thomas, who had started to study to be a cleric, to become the Archbishop of Canterbury. Henry never expected that Thomas would take it serious. He'd have a conversion of faith. He would side with the church. Henry no longer likes that. It's a challenge to Henry's power structure and what Henry wanted. One day the king, whether he meant it or not, is to have uttered the phrase, "Will someone not rid me of this meddlesome monk?" And henchmen of the king go and murder Thomas à Becket during the celebration of the liturgy. And so we see that very clear comparison. We don't know that the friendship between Stanislaus and the King of Poland was that of Henry and Thomas, but very clear parallels when you challenge the power structure and you become a voice for the voiceless, but the mass of the church, not the celebration of the Mass, but the masses of people can be led by you. The reigning authority sometimes chooses to do something to choke that message.
And we, of course, see historically in the life of Henry II a remorse that he has had. And I've often wondered, you had mentioned that there may not have been the same remorse with the King of Poland during this time, but there could very well have been, because we know Poland to be an extremely Catholic country. And so maybe at that time there might have been a conversion that we do not know about, or history has not told us about, that happened once Stanislaus was martyred for his faith during the celebration of the Mass, because no doubt the King of Poland may very well have been a Catholic. And so there's this whole sense of remorse that is part of these two stories in history, and how that plays oftentimes in the lives of Christians and sometimes in our own lives. We do things where we regret, or we wish that we had not have done them, and we know that it's through the grace of God, through the forgiveness of God, and hopefully the King of Poland and hopefully King Henry II understood God's forgiveness amidst all of this. And so we certainly encourage the folks that are with us, even though we've given little glimpses of the lives of some saints, to learn more about that. With the wonders of the internet, Google Saint Stanislaus and see what more they can discover about his life. We're going to talk about one more saint in just a moment, but we're going to take a quick break. Please stay with us. We'll be right back.
Well, I've been volunteering for 18, almost 20 years. What I do is help the elderly in their homes so that they can stay in their homes.
I think a lot of times the elderly in our society are forgotten, and that's unfortunate because they have so much wisdom to share.
The other day she told me that every night when she goes to bed, she thinks about her little angel, when her little angel's going to come and check on her the next day. And that's me, yeah.
By the time we can walk, each of us yearns for the joy that comes from being able to do for ourselves. Church World Service believes that being self-reliant is a joy everyone should share. So around the block or around the world, share the joy. Church World Service.
Welcome back to Communion of Saints. The saint we're going to talk about now is St. Martin I. Like the last saint, St. Stanislaus, that we spoke about, we didn't have an awful lot of information to share with the folks that are with us, and we find that also in the life of St. Martin I. But yet we'll talk about different aspects of his life that relate to other aspects of the lives of saints or the life of the church as well. So let's at least begin by talking about Martin I, when he died, when he reigned as pontiff.
Well, he lives during the 7th century, and his pontificate lasts about 6 years. Perhaps what in the fact that we know not a great deal about him, but that he is a saint in the church is because he is a martyr in the church. And we see that in the early church, the saints were all martyred. And then once the church is legal, there are people who just live long, holy lives. And the church needed to look at their example and their model. And so we develop a process of canonization and such. But there's still that long-standing tradition that if one is martyred for the faith, there isn't the same requirement, towards sainthood. And so we can see someone like Martin that we don't know a great deal about, that becomes an example in the church because of him offering his life through violence, because of his faithfulness and determination to spread the news of Jesus Christ. Back to his pontificate again, from 649 until his death in 655, it is hallmarked by the fact that at the beginning of his pontificate also is the Lateran Council. Now, we've talked a little bit about councils of the church. We've had over 20 ecumenical councils. Again, debate whether the Council of Jerusalem falls into that category, but we've talked about the first 4 great councils of the church from 325 to 451 that helped develop the Nicene Creed. But I think maybe for our viewers, this is an opportunity to also talk about just what that council or any council seeks to do. What it does is there are issues that are always arising in the church. Jesus, when he ascended into heaven and told the apostles, go out to all the nations, did not hand them a handbook and say, this is the church, nothing will ever change. What he did was he gave them the Spirit. What is the Spirit? The Spirit is breath. The Spirit is life. And so it is a living, breathing institution that from time to time has to always re-examine itself, not get rid of or not completely change, but address who we are as a people of faith now and how do we move forward on this journey of faith, always with the focus of bringing the people of God closer to God while here on earth, but ultimately in the joys of the kingdom. And so you have the development of the creed in the early church. And then throughout the history of the church has paused, called these ecumenical councils by calling bishops from all across the globe or wherever the church was reaching at that point to discern, to discuss, to debate, perhaps, sadly, sometimes to find different factions, but to come to a resolution and then declare, this is now the teaching of the church. If you are with the church, this is the teaching, this is the understanding we move forward with. Sadly, we know there are times when people were not able to accept a teaching. There were people that couldn't accept the divinity of God, the Arians, and so some of them fall away. We can go all the way up to the 60s with the Second Vatican Council, and there are people that don't believe in some of those reforms. And so we term them as the sede vacantis. They believe that because John the 23rd called the council and every pope since has upheld the teachings of the council, that there hasn't been a legitimate pope since Pius XII because they reject the teachings. Those are always isolated pockets. The majority of the church has always moved forward with the results of a particular council.
You had mentioned that there are 20-some councils. I think historically the church does designate, maybe not as a perfect ecumenical council, the Council of Jerusalem in 70, but there have been 21 councils, obviously Vatican II being the last, and the truly ecumenical council. This Council of the Lateran that Martin I convened had only 105 bishops. We know that there were over 2,000 bishops at the Vatican II gathering. And so there's that whole sense that the church now has become, and church always was, but now has become global. And we see that even now with the pontificate of Francis and his designation of certain cardinals within the church. No longer are they designating great cities around the world as cardinal dioceses or archdioceses, but small and insignificant ones. And so there's this whole sense that the church has become not even more global, but more encompassing of who the church really is. Mm-hmm. The church is not just the Pope and the bishops and the priests and the nuns. The church is the entire people of God. And that was one of the greatest teachings that really came out of Vatican II, is that the church is the people of God. And that whole sense that we make up the church, we are the body of Christ. And so whenever a pope convenes, as you had mentioned, a Vatican Council, there are particular reasons why that happens, or a council, why that happens. What's interesting is that in his life, that he is martyred at this particular time in the church's life as well. We don't know necessarily right now at this point historically what was going on at the time, but there was some reason why he was martyred for his faith. We do know that most of the popes in the early ages were martyred because of their standing up for the faith. But this was certainly well after 300 years after the legality of Christianity. So it would be interesting, perhaps, if the folks that are with us might want to learn more about Martin I, to go to the internet to find out more about him, to find out exactly what this Lateran Council was. We've talked about it briefly before the taping. We felt we didn't have enough information to give a real good sense of what that was, but let's encourage the folks that are with us to kind of do their own homework, to find out more about not just Martin I, but some of the other saints. We've just got a minute or so left of our time together. Any final thoughts, not just about Martin I, but about this whole series and segment that we talk about the saints?
Well, I think if we do want to close with Martin and the time and the council that we're talking about, it is important to note that it was the Lateran Council. It was held at the Basilica of St. John Lateran. There is no such person as St. John Lateran. We're talking about St. John the Baptizer, the forerunner of Jesus, but it gets its name in the merging of John the Baptizer, John the Baptist, and the Laterani family, Lateran, because they are the family that gave the land of which this basilica sits on. And the connection to Martin and even the connection to Francis is that while St. Peter Basilica is seen as the Vatican, as Bishop of Rome, the Holy Father's church, in his role as Bishop of Rome, his cathedral is the Basilica of St. John Lateran. And so we see in this council that was held in that basilica, it certainly would have been understanding the authority of the Pope who was overseeing the proceedings of this council.
We'd like to thank you for being with us. Have a good day, and God be with you.
The Communion of Saints was a production of CTNY, the Catholic Television Network of Youngstown. Your program hosts were Father Jim Corda and Father Jack Lavelle.